welcome everybody to Pandas Playing Cello.
Episode 16.
This will be episode 16. And
No, episode 17.
episode 17, that's right. We have episode 16 is, as they say, in the can.
That's right.
And we are very excited to have with us Dennis Gleason, who is do you mind if I say it, a former colleague of mine at a three-letter agency that is altogether too notorious, and has carved out a career for himself. And I will let him describe that.
Sure. So thank you for having me. Like Carmen said, my name's Dennis Gleason. I'm a recovering political analyst. And I'm probably, the way I think of myself as an analyst, probably one of the analysts who is least hostile to technology in kind of like intelligence circles. And I think it's important to say that like analysts are not inherently hostile to technology. Some are. My hostility flows from the fact that I've never been able to figure out why technology doesn't do a better job of supporting analysis. And so
can I just interject here, Dennis?
Yeah, sure.
Two explanatory notes. So political analysts, we don't mean like someone that would appear on a Sunday morning talk show.
Or write an op-ed for New York Times.
Or write an op-ed. By what we mean by a political analyst would be someone who studies the politics and society of another country to try to make sense of it for US policymakers. Is that fair?
So some decision maker would go to you. It's like, just to get really clear, because I'm more of the outside point of view here. Some decision maker would go to you and say, so if your area of expertise was the Middle East, after October 7th would come to you and say, we've got people looking at the defense implications, et cetera, but tell us about the political implications. Is this true?
That's fair. Or the political analyst would work with a military analyst, with an economic analyst, and together they would try to explain, hey, let us give you a sense of what's going to happen over the next 3 to 7 days, what the implications are for the next 3 months. Less commonly, they might say, and let us speculate what this means for the next year or two.
Okay, so it's closer term sort of foresight or strategic analysis. But how common was it sorry, we're probably like this is the middle of, but how common was it to have, an economist or a behavioral economist, say, and a military person and a political analyst and a technology analyst come together to do that? I mean, is that the common approach, or is it mostly independent? Everything goes up to the decision maker and they sort of put it together?
No, my experience, somewhat dated, right, is that it was very common. I mean, even if I, as a political analyst, wrote my own analysis, it would be coordinated like with a whole bunch of different people, to include other political analysts. But if it touched on military and security issues, a military analyst would go take a look at it. If it touched on economic or leadership issues, those sorts of analysts. I mean, I think that's the one thing, kind of getting ahead of myself here a little bit. It's like when we talk about like AI, right? What the agency and the US government really has, the intelligence community has, is they have countless human expert systems of varying degrees of like expertise and maturity and sophistication, right? The thing is that they don't work as standalone people. I mean, it is really when something leaves the agency headquarters, it's a corporate product. And so not only is coordination done kind of at a working level, but then there's a whole editing and review process that just keeps making sure that the argumentation is sound, that we're asking a good question, that it's presented in a clear and compelling way. And, very rarely is a piece of analysis just a one-off piece of analysis, is that it's actually part of a larger analytic line. And it's common to have people in the best possible way challenge the direction of that line to say, hey,
That's wonderful. Why would you mess with that?
No, and you absolutely shouldn't, right? But where I was getting to is like, so when we talk about like today's AIs, right? What you have is a bunch of subject matter experts or people who are developing subject matter expertise, who are in an environment where they are being fed by other experts and are being encouraged to like kind of experience life in other places and think more broadly about like what the thing they're focused on is really about. And so like when I talk to analysts about today's AIs, right? More often than not, they're like, it's interesting, but it's not compelling because it's working at a generalist level. And for a generalist, it's not as interesting as talking to other experts.
I would agree with you. I have been playing around with ChatGPT, and I know that also playing around with an instance of ChatGPT that Julia is training, and I have had a hard time getting it to generate either questions or comments for me that I find interesting. I think the bar for AI helping analysts is higher than a lot of AI enthusiasts think it is. I think it's achievable, but I just think it is higher than they think it is. I think that, you know, I don't know why, but I think people tend to think that we're, that what the CIA does is kind of like at the university level of analysis. And it's,
Well, why can you
it's-
blame us? I
it's-
mean, like, how would we know?
well, that's
Right?
true. How would you know? And I've been arguing, for some time now that we really should become more transparent on a lot of these issues. But yeah.
Yeah, if you want help from the technology sector for analysis, you're gonna have to explain, like, tradecraft is not rocket science, right? It's like critical thinking plus intuition plus more critical thinking plus more intuition, right? And so if you want help from the technology sector, you do have to explain what's going on and be willing to receive that help, to admit that you might, like, things might actually get better. Like, so like when I heard Dennis, when I heard you talk about the process of analysis, what seemed like this is very good. It's a very good process. Sounds very good. It's like getting a bunch of scientists in a room and trying to figure something out. It's very good. Different fields. What isn't there, at least you didn't describe, is the feedback. So was the analysis correct? And how do you go back and do credit assignment? How do you go back and do adjustment of the process based on the future? I mean, is that in there or is that missing?
Yeah. So let me give you a snarky answer and then I can give you a more serious answer, right?
I'm glad, Dennis, that you haven't changed.
I really haven't, Carmen, right?
I do remember the snark, and at some point I want to tell a story about an interaction between the two of us that I hope you remember. But go ahead.
I am all but certain I know what you're talking about and happy to have you share that. I mean, the best way to do that kind of introspective, like how good was our analysis, was having a spectacular intelligence failure.
Yeah.
Right? Because as soon as we have a spectacular intelligence failure, somebody gets called up to the Hill and gets wire brushed for a little bit in a committee hearing. We tend to go through a period of like self-flagellation and introspection. And then we say, how can we try to like patch this airplane while it's flying so that doesn't happen again? So we keep, for as much as people like bang on the US military for like trying to fight the last war, we are I think the intelligence community's reaction is, how do we prevent the last failure?
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Much like the military.
much like the military. And I mean, it's when a failure happens, I mean, it's not like, oh, what a bunch of idiots. It's a bunch of smart people are like, oh, we had not thought about that, or we had not accounted for that. Or lo and behold, when we talk about like particularly the agency, but the intelligence community writ large, when we say we want a global coverage capability, that is like if you want to know everything that could affect US national interests anywhere in the world, that's like a sizable resource commitment. And I mean, I think this is a case where like being able to automate part of that process. And so what I described to you was the production process, right? Before that, there's a discovery and research process. A lot of triaging takes place there. Because no organization ever has all the information it needs, there's a lot of jumping back and forth between the internet and like whatever proprietary systems folks have. From the production, there's editing and review. From editing and review, there is a feedback mechanism. In some cases, it's probably more detailed and specific than others. But
The feedback mechanism before it's released to a decision maker or after?
After.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, before would be.
They have a chance. And I mean, in many cases, analysts, or their managers or somebody has a relationship with the customer where they are frequently talking with them about, hey, this is what I'm thinking about. What are you seeing? What are you thinking about? Because making sure that we come out with, and I think this is a two-edged blade really, but making sure like product is relevant really matters. The problem is like relevance at times is something that either no one has really thought about before, or how do you come up with this anticipatory, hey, what happens? And I mean, I would like to think somebody's thinking about this, right? Is like, what happens when we do actually see the emergence of the first super intelligence, right? It's going to be very hypothetical, right? And it's going to be rife with assumptions, but it's still, at that point, it's not doing like an emission of like inform and warn. It's a responsibility of like, hey, you as policymakers really should be thinking about this.
Right. It's more of like foresight area.
Or insight.
Yeah.
Foresight.
Yeah, well, both.
So
yeah.
I to put it in the language or in the environment of academic journals, and I imagine that more than 50%, you can give me the percentage of articles in areas that you're an expert on in academic journals don't really break new ground or create new insights.
Oh no, it's 50% is low for that. It would be like 90%.
90% don't.
I would suggest, yeah, based on a paper that came out last year, yeah, something like that. It's a huge problem. In fact, the innovative nature and the disruptive nature of scientific discovery has gone down in the last 2 decades, even though we've had the internet.
So this is the same thing with analysis. Analysis, you're taking up a policymaker's time, and believe me, they are busy. I mean, they are not faux busy. They are really busy. Sometimes with faux work, but nevertheless, they're busy. And they are also an expert on the Middle East. There isn't a person in the State Department or the NSC or the Department of Defense who's working on the Middle East who doesn't have considerable expertise on the Middle East. So you come along as an analyst and you're trying to get them spend 5 minutes on my paper. They spend 5 minutes on the paper, and it provides no insight. Not because the analyst isn't intelligent, didn't work hard, didn't follow the proper methods. It's just because fill in the blank. It's just because it's hard to see things in new ways. And I always thought the greatest praise an analyst could get from a policymaker would be, oh, that's interesting, or oh, I hadn't thought of that before. I mean, that last one, that's like gold, you know. It doesn't have to be foresight, just, you know, sometimes just
Anything new.
explaining what's going on now in a way they hadn't thought about it is very useful. So,
Well, maybe that's a good use of technology, because in order to give someone a new idea, you kind of need to know how their brain works, right? Like what are their ideas about the situation? So maybe technology can help, but in this process that you described, Dennis, maybe this is a silly idea and obvious, but maybe it's not, where the technology could help model the mind of the decision maker that this product is going to, so that you go, oh, they're thinking about it this way. I have this other idea that arises when I hear that. I want to look into this, and I'm going to write up an analytic product that's related to this to try to give them some insight. Is that something that seems possible?
I mean, I think, and Carmen, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Like, engaging the customer is really hard because of how busy they are. I think what you described, Julia, would actually be better off for the analyst,
Right.
and for the analytic organization, right? To say, hey, look, over the last 30 days, 90 days, 180 days, year, this is what your coverage looks like compared to the coverage of the New York Times, then the BBC and NPR and The Economist. Like, pick high quality publications and say, hey, what are they saying? And how does it compare to what you're saying? And you want to know if there's going to be gaps, and that's okay, because each has their own proprietary sources of information. But there also, will be news holes that might warrant coverage.
Right. Right. Yeah. So modeling, it's modeling the state of knowledge of key players to inform
let me tell you
analyst.
something on that will, I think, surprise many listeners who are persuaded that the CIA keeps files on all Americans. So the injunction at the CIA against collecting the prohibition of the CIA against collecting information on US citizens was so strong that bringing a customer relation management software into the agency was like, oh, I don't know that we can do that, because that would be seen as collecting information. Am I right on that, Dennis?
That I don't know.
I mean, I was in conversations where people say, wouldn't it be great if we knew X, Y, or Z about our customer preferences? And someone said, I don't think we can collect that.
Well, if it's open source information, right? I mean,
no.
Oh.
No. The statutory prohibition is severe.
So any information, even if I have a sign outside my house that says, the following is true.
Exactly. No collection and assemblage of information on
that has got to have been relaxed.
Huh? No.
That has got to have been relaxed. How does the CIA compete with any private intelligence firm then that doesn't have that prohibition?
Well, we don't do it against US citizens. We have
right, but I mean, any private US intelligence firm will just do that. They could just buy tech company data on.
That's fine. They can do that, but and whenever we slip up on that, because, for example, buying data, you might buy a big block of data and there's some US stuff in it that you didn't know was in it, or you were vacuuming up a whole bunch of data and there's some US stuff in it that you didn't know was in it. Anytime that's that happens and it's discovered by the press, it's a huge scandal.
Yeah.
Usually, from what I know, it's just kind of like a mistake or an error, but
Maybe there could be an exception for like you're working with the Secretary of
no,
State and
no.
no,
I mean,
okay.
I kind of, and I kind of agree with the idea that it's a slippery slope and we don't get into it. Again, this
Yeah.
will come as a surprise to
Okay,
some of
but
you
so
who
can
are
the person,
listening.
but can the analyst meet with,
Of
and,
course.
okay,
yeah.
but can they write down notes?
Yep.
Can they write
Probably
down
for their own,
notes?
I think they could write down notes for their own use.
Could they
Could
write down
you?
notes in their own AI that's used for keeping track of modeling different people they might, but that no one else sees?
I don't think that would be, I don't, if I were the policymaker or the decision maker on that, I would say, stop that.
There,
Don't
Wow.
start
that would
feeding the
warrant.
AI information about our customers. Bad, bad, bad idea.
So, Julia, to like explain a little bit more, right? I mean, what is
Wow.
okay is incidental collection,
Mm-hmm.
right? That if you
Help me
appear,
understand the distinction there. What's incidental?
yeah. So if I have a subscription to the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever, right? The assumption is the focus is on the world section of those papers, right? The international parts.
Right.
And so if I, Dennis Gleason, appear in a New York Times article and I appear on a like an IC system, it's okay because it's incidental. It wasn't targeting me, it was a subscription and it just happened to come in. Where things start to change is if I, Dennis Gleason, stuck on my front yard a big sign that said, hashtag Team Al Qaeda, right? Suddenly, like if I start appearing in mentions of a foreign organization, right?
Right.
Or Team FSB or Team whoever, right? Then that it starts to slip into, okay, what is his relationship with a foreign organization? You can't collect on me. However, if I have like what is a interesting, potentially important relationship with a foreign organization, different sets of rules apply. However, like to Carmen's point, like we are not the agency, the agency certainly doesn't really care about US citizens, and we don't care by virtue.
I wouldn't say it that way.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it that way. You're right. They don't focus on US citizens.
I mean, the whole idea is to protect US citizens.
Yeah.
Right. So, but they don't focus on gathering data from US citizens.
We don't do it. It's not even the focus is the wrong word. It is prohibited.
Right. And so that's like Proud Boys or any of the like far right organizations.
That's more like FBI, right? No, I get that. I'm just trying to figure out if I want to model, if I'm an analyst and I need to model the mind of Anthony Blinken or someone.
You can do it in your own mind. You can
Okay,
do
so
it for yourself in your own mind. I can't stop you from doing that. But
so this is an argument for psychics. I mean, basically working at CIA, right?
Well,
because
let me
that kind of information is not considered real information.
So maybe let me turn it on its head a little bit, Julia, which would be okay, is if you said, hey, look, I want to compile every interview or every piece of biographic information I have about Vladimir Putin.
Right.
And I wanted to build a model to try to get some insight into how he might think or how.
Oh, sure. Obviously, that's a good use of technology at CIA, right?
Totally in bounds.
Yeah, and I would assume that they're working on that or doing that or have that because that seems obvious.
I would assume that it's done in an analog way.
Really?
I know that it's done in an analog way. Yeah. Whether or not it's being done in other ways, I don't know.
I mean, that would be my first thing if I were doing GPT for CIA. It's like, let's go feed it into our model. Yeah.
Yeah. So the agency, for a ton of really good reasons, is a risk-averse organization. And the risk comes from security. And so there is a whole bunch of controls on what technology is used, what data is used in conjunction with that technology, what analysts can actually take a look at that combination of data and technology. And so, like, we're all out here playing with AI, right? And I mean, we are to varying degrees finding it either interesting or unsatisfying, right? I think it is, technology adoption is always slower at the agency. And I think it's always slower within any organization that deals with classified work or classified content, because their sense of risk is elevated, and for like some very good reasons, right? Whether it's an insider threat sort of problem or a data breach sort of problem, like these are like real. It's one thing, when the software that schedules my haircuts gets hacked, not a big deal, right? It's another thing when you have somebody like Snowden walk out.
Sure.
And
But what do you think? I mean, I don't want to spend all our time trying to explain to Julia, the newbie,
yeah.
what this is going on. I mean, you have some really interesting ideas from your paper that just got published in Studies in Intelligence about how AI could be useful and how it is currently not. And I don't know about you, Carmen, but I would love to hear you talk about how
Absolutely, yeah.
it could be useful to the IC. And what do you think is the lowest hanging fruit there? I mean, in terms, especially given what you just spoke about, risk and, the low, or I guess the low speed of adoption.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in some ways an opportunity, right? And I think it's an opportunity because, like, we should just stop. I mean, when we talk about AI, right, what we're really doing is amplifying the marketing message that came out of Silicon Valley. AI is not intelligent, right? Like, it's not intelligent in the way that humans are. It does some really interesting things, but it's not intelligent, right?
Okay, can we just stop there for a second?
Yeah.
So William James's definition of intelligence I really like, which is, I'm going to paraphrase here, but finding a way to do something when the first way that you had to do something didn't work. Being able to, like, an agent is intelligent if it can troubleshoot a way around roadblocks, if it can't just, if it's not just hardwired to do the thing and then it hits a wall. So solving problems. I feel like certainly both expert systems, machine learning, and GPTs are all intelligent by that definition. So what is your definition of intelligence in other words, here's what I feel under the surface. What I feel under the surface, especially from people who are focused on using their minds, so knowledge workers, but not just knowledge workers, like creative knowledge workers. I feel that there's a little bit of concern that if AIs are intelligent, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for humans? And I feel like that's an important question, but I sort of feel like that helps bias people against thinking that AIs are intelligent because we're afraid. So I feel like it can be a bias, and I just wonder when you just make a blanket statement like they're not intelligent, what do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is, if I were, and I do this about once a week, I'll ask ChatGPT, I'll ask Perplexity, I'll ask Bard, what's going to happen between Israel and Hamas over the next 2 weeks?
Oh, yeah.
And the answer that I routinely get is, hey, that's a really complex and fast moving situation. You should read the news.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, there are people who are talking about what they think is going to happen, right? There are, and if I were talking to a human analyst, right, a human analyst would say, well, if I look at their disposition of forces and kind of the rhetoric coming out of both sides, I can't give you a perfect answer, but I can at least maybe just like wave my arms broadly, and you'll at least be a little bit prepared for whatever happens.
But that's apples and oranges. I mean, the question you're asking, right? What's going to happen of some, sorry?
The question I'm asking requires some degree of creativity and analytic creativity.
Which you can create if you create your own GPT that's trained up on the Middle East situation, right? You train it up on the Middle East situation, you configure it to say you're an expert on the Middle East, you look into the future based on past patterns, look at social, political, and economic situations, and then you inform when someone asks you a question about the future, you inform them with your best guess. You could actually build that. So just because ChatGPT sort of general doesn't do it, or or any of these others.
And that's a fair point, right?
Yeah.
But the question is, how many people are going to be able to build those like kind of expert systems?
Everybody. It's so easy. It's like the thing is they're democratizing the technology. When I say configure, I'm talking about writing those words. You don't have to write a single line of code. Like it's a major shift in the culture of technology. Someone with a good idea can write a bunch of sentences about how they want it to operate, and it will operate that way. So it's different, right? It's like training an analyst.
Yes. However, okay, so I've done this, right? I mean,
Right.
and I can't get ChatGPT to tell me how many sentences are in an article.
No, it's not good at that. It's not good at counting. It's not good at left hemisphere stuff.
But like the amount, you would be surprised at like how much analysis is just based on simple counts.
Yeah, so that's what you would use a machine learning algorithm for to go. I mean, so it's like you have to know what tool to use. It's like you're working with two different people. Well, the GPT is in like a dream state. They're very intuitive, right? And then you go to the person who's like the bean counter and you ask about the number of sentences in the article.
Let me jump in here.
Yeah.
If I can, so what I find lacking with my interactions so far is that it is not an intellect with a free will. And I use the word intellect on purpose, perhaps incorrectly. But when you are talking with a fascinating mind, you're talking with another person who has a fascinating mind.
It is not. I agree.
They will tell you, and that's where the free will comes in. You'll say XYZ, and they'll go, like they'll find something. Your XYZ has reminded them of something way out there that they bring into the conversation, superficially, totally unrelated, and then perhaps you get it. You get why that connection got made, and then you wander off into whole new areas of insight.
Yes, and you can actually get it to do that, but you have to tell it to change its temperature rating. I mean, that's what turns it into what they call hallucinations, but those are really interesting insights that are associated in some kind of mathematical way. So I get it. I'm playing this as if I'm like an AI advocate right now, but I get the same frustration that you do. But I'm just sort of pointing out, like, someone in that technology world would say, like, well, you're not using it to its fullest extent. You're not making it do the thing you want to do. So that's just a straw man argument for you.
And I mean, I think, Julia, that going back to your point of, hey, if you want technologists to help, then you need to talk to them about what you do. Animals are horrible at that.
I know.
We tend to be like deep introverts, right?
Yeah.
And we tend not to suffer fools.
Right.
And in a harsh, and the funny thing about it is, like, we're probably, it's the only organization I've ever been in where you can go and have a knife fight on Thursday morning and on Friday afternoon be at a happy hour with the same people. It is brutal. I mean,
that's very much like the tech world, by the way. Like that's a very similar cultural piece.
so perhaps culturally there's commonality. There's a reason I'm not consulted to design bridges, right? I mean, I'm a horrible engineer. I'd be sued, right? And I think that is the part that is missing. And I mean, to your point, maybe democratization helps like narrow that gap.
Maybe.
However, like for in my experience, for that to work, right, you need to find an analyst who's actually a good data engineer, right? Or you need to find a data engineer who actually knows the substantive contours of the data that an analyst uses.
Or you just find a technology designer who can talk to both parties.
Sure.
Right? I mean, just you need a bridge.
Right. And at this point, and I mean, we've kind of seen it with I think we've seen it with Google and with Facebook and with Twitter, pre-Muskification, right? Is they are heavy engineering organizations. And in being heavy engineering organizations, the softer side of liberal arts, and I mean, they're trying to correct that, right? There's a huge hiring binge for poets and artists in these spaces, right? Substantive analysts, be they like at a think tank or within an academic organization, I think that's harder. They haven't quite gotten to that point yet. And I mean, they will. I mean, at some point, somebody's going to be like, oh, there's money to be made here, right? Directly or indirectly, and they'll do something. But right now, I mean, the closest is probably Perplexity AI, right? They provide like the sourcing for the assertions the AI makes. That's a huge step forward.
So one thing, Dennis, I'd be curious to hear your reaction to. I believe that in a very short number of years, that policymakers will be able to have an AI assistant who crawls through whatever information they tell it to crawl through. The policymaker trains the AI assistant on their mental model. That's perfectly fine, right?
Right. They're an American citizen, but they're also
and they're using their own personal model. And that AI assistant will be able to provide a lot of the intelligence support that the intelligence community does now. And what not all of it, but the phrase I've used, and I've used it with leaders of the intelligence community who are still in, and I said that, I think about 50% of analysts can't do much more than, filter and summarize, that they're, that insight, let alone foresight hurdle is just too high for them. And they've agreed. So what's your reaction to that?
I think it's fair. I think it's also an opportunity, right? Is in my experience, and like I joined in February 2002, I was in the immediate aftermath of September 11th. And there was understandably a shift towards very tactical current intelligence, right? The world was a dangerous place in 2002. We were still trying to figure out what happened, right?
Right.
I think, Carmen, to your point, yeah, that you're going to have, and it's not just decision makers, it's going to be all of us, right? We're going to have these, we've called them virtual personal assistants in the past, right? the difference is they're going to just become more capable and smarter. I think what that creates the opportunity for is moving away from that like tactical repertorial summarization to say, okay, hey, how do we take our analytically creative people and have them generate not just the language of a prompt, right? But how do they start framing out scenarios or their own interpretations of like non-linear futures that to start being able to organize or like structure some of the writing that's being done? Because I think the other part that like I find missing, right, is the contextual element. And so to be able to, and I mean, I think at the end of the day, right, like most analysts, if I think of Rob Johnson's piece where he's like, most analysts can't tell you what they do, right? When I think about it, I'm like, we're really in the like change detection business in the
Yes.
sense making business.
Right, exactly.
Yep.
And
Agree.
so, and that's something that actually AI is actually good at, is detecting a pattern within a large volume of data.
Very
right?
good at it.
Super good, right? However, I think what I keep going back to is within a collection of data, right? And so, like, to me, the problem with large language models is I actually don't know what data is in there. Now,
Right.
can I build my own large language model to do that? Sure, right? But I think at the end of the day, at least for professional analysts, be they in government or the private sector or in academia, right, it is wildly inefficient to have 5,000 different LLMs out there, data repositories out there. Here's a case where, and I mean, for the government, it's really taking a look at like, well, okay, so what is your data strategy? What data do you need to do your job? And for the analysts, it's often, to Carmen's point about like, well, what differentiates like the repertorial and summarizing analyst from the like more senior analyst
It's not the
is
data.
it's not the data. It's
Yeah.
the insight, and it's them talking about the gaps in the data. And so if you can start having analysts write these, like to one degree or another, speculative pieces, I mean, informed speculation, right? I think it changes the job of an analyst a little, Carmen, in the context of what you're describing, right? But at the same time, Julie, I think it feeds into the data repository against which an AI works in a way, I mean, rather than thinking of it as binary, right? The question I think for the foreseeable future is, what does human machine teaming look like in a professional setting? And what does a learning AI look like in a professional setting? And how does a learning AI help improve the performance of the individual analyst?
Yeah.
Well, I would like to have an AI buddy that I could give it all my ideas, a particular idea, and ask it to go find data, points of evidence, events, facts, trends that are either in support of this idea or argue against the idea. I think that would be a great service.
Okay, I will give you the wise counsel. I have the wise counsel built into my student of humanity, also built into the analyst gut check AI. And I want you to try to see, like if you say, look, I have this idea, convene
Right.
the wise council and see what they say and see what you get. Because that's what that's for.
But
And I
the
think
Wise
it's,
Council, I mean, I've used the Wise Council. This is this instance that Julie has built. I've used the Wise Council, but it just, tells me what Plato would have said, or Descartes would have said, or Einstein would have said, or
what
something.
do you want it to do? Tell me what you want
I
it to do
wanted to
again.
actually, I want to give the AI the hypothesis and it find the data.
Oh, well, just ask it to do that.
Yeah.
I'll
So,
get, yeah, try it in that instance. See, because I think it could.
yeah.
Yeah.
Find the
But
data points.
but see, that's great. I love what you said, Dennis, about human analysts or human analysts, sorry. Analysts are humans. Um, Analyst AI or human AI teaming. Yeah, well, I'm the same with engineers, right? But because that's what it's all about, is what is the relationship that we're crafting. And I agree that it's super inefficient to make a bunch of LLMs. The other problem with making a bunch of LLMs for each organization based on whatever they want, whatever they think of as truth, is that you end up with all these different versions of truth. And then you have the same problem where you can't talk to each other because you don't know what their version of truth is.
Right.
That's a huge problem that can't be sort of overstated, right? But um, but this idea of the analyst using the AI as one source, and then Carmen, this combines with your idea of having the AI help find sources, but it's one source of information, and you're doing the creative work, is what it's all about, right? I mean, I don't know. Seems like it's what it's all about.
And to kind of build on that, Julia, I mean, I sit here and I think, for as much as I think, like, and I'm biased, right? Is I think analysts should be part of like how AI is developed, right? Really, like, I don't want just analysts, right? Because analysts are
No, you don't.
maybe not the best model of like social creatures in the known universe,
Well, and
right?
engineers have already screwed it up, right? Like you're just doubling down.
It's but like, so what happens when we start bringing in psychologists and social psychologists and
And
sociologists, right?
storytellers, yeah.
And storytellers, right? Is I think that like the more my concern with AI today, right, is we're accruing technical and technological debt and philosophical debt that it's actually going to take us time to recover from.
Mhm.
And the problem is, like, that debt has a momentum of its own.
Yes.
And the longer it goes on, the harder it's going to be able to slow or redirect that momentum. And I think the answer is, rather is a lot of prototyping and experimentation. And Julie, I mean, I think you do a great job of this, is saying, hey, we're going to do it at a relatively small scale with like very deliberate intent, right? The challenge is like, how do you start elbowing in between OpenAI and Bard and Anthropic and Perplexity? And the answer is, well, maybe if you find that niche and it's a compelling niche, that's awesome, right? My What I struggle with is because the one thing that we keep going back to is the underlying data. Carmen wants her agent to go out into the data and find points that support or like refute her assertion. Well, data, and I mean, I think, Julie, it was you who brought up the point that if you're working off of different data sets, you can come up with different answers, right? And the answer is right by virtue of the data that you have access to, even if it's totally wrong,
But that
right?
started happening like 20 years ago in science, just using the search engine,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Because the
And
papers are ranked according to how many times they're cited, and if they're cited more, they're more correct. That's the right. So yeah,
I think here's a point where it would be interesting to see like the emergence of a certification process right? Or a set of standards around information quality to say, hey, look, this LLM was built to these standards and it contains this data, right? Wikipedia is awesome for what it is. If you're a generalist who's just looking for a really quick, basic answer to a question, it's awesome, right? Analysts don't ever use it, or they use it as just that initial point of departure to figure out what else they should really do their individual research on. And I think that is probably another facet of AI, right? Is like when I've been using Perplexity a lot, I've been using ChatGPT a lot. And I'm always amazed when it gives me a 2-page answer when I really wanted 3 sentences.
Oh my God, it's so verbose. You can make it less verbose. Yeah.
Yeah. And in the same way, it's funny where like usually a lot of times, the number of times where my next question is, hey, could you summarize your answer into 2 sentences?
Yeah.
And it does a good job of that, right?
It does.
And
Yeah.
it's just a matter of like baking that into its behavior, to your point.
Yeah.
To say, hey, look, put the onus on me that if I want to know more, I will ask for more information. What I'm looking for is a 2-sentence answer.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
And
we're
to
approaching an hour here.
Oop.
I think. Yes, we are
Oh,
approaching an hour. And I wanted to give you, Dennis, an opportunity to say anything else you wanted to say about where you think AI is headed, particularly from the article. And then I was hoping we could trade our stories back and forth to see if we remember the same story. Because I bet we don't.
I want to hear that
Absolutely.
story. That's the top
Because
priority.
memories are so personal. But
Yes.
go ahead, Dennis.
So, I think where we are with AI right now is no one's an expert and we're still all trying to figure it out, right? We are in the era of MySpace. There is no Facebook, right? The point I make in the paper, and I've kind of made elsewhere, is that for as much time and effort is being put into developing algorithms right now, if I were at an organization, I'd be focused exclusively on the organization's data. Because really, I would expect that at this point, every 12 to 18 months, and then like once the dust starts settling down, that probably every 2 to 5 years, I'd be swapping out my AI in its entirety. What doesn't change is the data that I have.
That's probably a good idea.
And so if I focused on the data and made it so that it is as analytically flexible as possible, right? I think this is the other part is, the question's always like, well, what questions do analysts have? And it's like, it changes every single day. And more often than not, they don't know what questions they're going to be asked to answer that day. And so if you focus on the flexibility of data, I think we're going to get to a point where data is going to be the differentiator. And like fixing data is not an inconsequential task. But I would also say that it's going to require some sort of certification or standard to say, the information quality contained in this data set is, whatever metric we use, right? To say, one, just basic facts, it goes back this far, we think it's this complete,
Some like blockchain model of data where when it's changed and why it has been changed or something. Yeah.
Right. And I think just to go on this, I made this note earlier, is like in the context of AI, right? And thinking about what an analyst does over the course of the day, right? They are dynamically reweighting data in a contextual sense.
Yes.
Like several times a minute.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not, right. As they read something, they're like
They're adjusting weights all over the place. Yeah.
all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you multiply that by, let's say, a notional team of analysts or a group of analysts or an analytic cadre, like that amount of like dynamic reweighting is pretty stunning.
Well, and then the weights in one affect the weights in the other. So if you had a model of each one after they retire, you could keep them, the really good ones around, and they're continuing to reweight things.
Yeah,
Sorry, I went
yes,
off into the deep end there.
like the emergence of new information, right? At what point does their weighting become irrelevant by virtue of the trend has progressed beyond what
Yes.
they base their.
Oh, but then you would reweight those according to the trend, right? Like if you kept them updated, and what you're doing is you're codifying their minds. And so if you keep those updated, then they should be okay.
But well, it's an interesting question, right? I'd be interested in the methodology to do that, right? So yeah, that's kind of where I think we are.
That's awesome.
All right, story time. This
Okay.
is my story, Dennis. The
All right.
interaction I most remember. I'm in the strategic assessments group. I read an admin notice from security. They've just noticed that cell phones, it's about 2003. They've just noticed that cell phones are about to get cameras. And so they announced that, it used to be you could bring the cell phone onto the compound, but it had to stay in your car. And they announced that you will not be able to bring cell phones on the compound and leave it in your car if it has a camera. That is too much of a security risk, and that security will inform us in a later release what cell phones we're allowed to buy in case we're confused about this. So my memory is I bring Dennis into the office and I go, Dennis, have you read this? And we talk about it for a second. I go, Dennis, send security a notice saying that, do you know that cars are about to get cameras? And are they going to tell us what cars we can buy? Because I was too important to be so inflammatory. So I was going to leave it to Dennis, the unimportant peon, to be inflammatory like that. And you refused to do it, but we had a good chuckle about it.
Yeah.
That's my memory. Do you remember
And
that?
so, absolutely I do. And Julia, that story is illustrative of the risk aversion of the organization.
Yeah, I get it.
I mean,
But what are you going to take a picture of from your car, though? I mean, I'm just curious. Like, what's the idea?
You could take a picture of all the license plates that are on the agency compound. And
oh, well, that's a real risk.
And of course, it's a real risk. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, Northern Virginia would have become the nation's largest market for used cars.
Yes.
Right. I mean, there was one of the common jokes was, thank God the agency was founded after the creation of telephones. Because if telephones came into existence, like after the agency's foundation,
we wouldn't have them.
We'd have carrier pigeons and vacuum tubes.
Yep. Now, do you have a different story, Dennis?
Wow.
So I was thinking of when I returned from my government-sponsored vacation, and Carmen's my new boss, and she very sweetly offers to give me kind of a return hug. And I am introverted enough that I kind of paused, and her like being really good at reading people for an analyst, right? Analysts tend to be like usually somewhere on the sociopathic like scale, right? Is she kind of looked at me and she's like, okay, that's no problem. Maybe, rather than a hug, I can just give you a welcome home chuck on the shoulder. And she gave me a chuck on the shoulder, and I'm just like, thank God for being home in a like community where everyone understands like there are a whole bunch of idiosyncrasies at play here.
Well, I don't remember that, but I'm sure it happened.
Yeah, government sponsored vacations.
I think you all should have parties with technologists because y'all are exactly the same. Exactly the same.
Yes.
So
Oh,
Dennis, how do people contact you? Or are you, so what's your, where do you hang your hat?
Right now I am, my hat is still on my head. I'm looking for a place to hang it.
Okay.
They can find me certainly on LinkedIn. And then the writing I do is over on Substack under appropriately The Angry Analyst.
Okay.
send us a link so we can stick it in the
Yeah,
description.
absolutely.
I'll absolutely do that.
Cool. What a great conversation. Are either of you two analyst types up for some dancing? Okay. I thought I'd give it a shot. I knew the answer was
I
no.
danced yesterday and no, I did not dance yesterday. Never mind.
We didn't do it last week.
Last week. I danced last week.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a strict no dancing policy, even though I don't even know what dancing is.
You can just tell. It has the word dancing in it.
Yeah, well, but Julia, so this is the thing about analysts, right?
No, I know.
We hate not being experts or competent.
I know. It's hilarious.
And so you spring something on that like that, and it's like, I need to research this because I want to.
What are the implications of dancing?
It's alarming.